Ed West, Paul Morland. Welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me as a duet this time.
Thanks for having us.
Is it your first one?
No, Ed has also been on the show. He was on the show about 10 episodes before you, I think, Paul. Maybe 9
No, but
episodes.
is it your first time with two guests?
Oh, no, it's not. It's my second time. I've had a couple of, a historian on before with his development economist pal. I spoke to Peter Heather and John Rapley about why empires fall. So they were bringing a different hypothesis as to why empires fall instead of just the Gibeonian barbarians into the Roman Empire. They were talking about debt cycles and all of those things. So everyone go and check that out. That's a plug from a previous episode.
Will do.
Well, I've spoken to you both about your various fields of interest in the past. Paul as a demographer and Ed as a historian, and you two have joined forces to produce something called the Canon Club, an excellent podcast, which is giving people a real introduction to various key figures within the Western canon, and also those who have, I would say, quite unheralded and perhaps not considered to be a part of it. So, Paul, as a demographer, how did you end up deciding that it was important for people to understand why the Western canon is our birthright?
Well, I don't know that it really relates to my demography very directly. I suppose they are my two main interests, are demography and generally culture, whatever that means. And I suppose I do have a sense, though, if there is a link between the two of them, of the tide going out of something we're losing in the West. Now, as I always say in demography, the problems of low fertility rates, aging and declining populations are not a specifically Western thing. The West was the first into them. In many ways, they're worse in East Asia and in parts of Latin America. So this is very much a human problem, but the West was first into it and first out of the demographic transition in a way. And in the same sense, I feel there is some loss of Western civilization, whatever that means, and we'll probably come on to that in due course. And that has two aspects. One is what's being produced today. Is it better or worse than in the past? And that I don't really feel qualified to opine on. I think a lot of novels that are coming out today are probably as good as things that were written in the 19th century. Art is challenging and very different, but I don't feel very qualified to talk about that. But if I think about someone like Beethoven, clearly ahead of his time, clearly a bit mad, and got on people's nerves. And yet, he had a serious audience. And earlier composers were definitely writing for their contemporaries. And, people like Bruckner and Mahler and Shostakovich were hugely appreciated in their day. It's very difficult to think of composers today who are appreciated that widely, whether that's to do with the nature of what they're writing or the nature of the audiences. But apart from that, so what's the quality of the output today, which I've got absolutely no ability to do anything about anyway. I do think there's a loss of appreciation. And the example, I always think of this, and funnily enough, I was listening to a podcast I did with Louise Perry. Yes, I'm afraid unlike Ed, I do like listening to my own podcast. If I don't like it, I do it because I think I learn about what I do well and what I don't do well, and therefore I improve. So actually, I was saying this on a podcast I did with Louise Perry, but it was recorded a long time ago and only came out last week. And so I said it there, but I'll say it again. It very much struck me when I was a child. My parents had a shop, and they had a shop assistant called Celia, very charming, very good with the customers, never wanted any kind of responsibility. She did what she did, and her husband was a shop worker similarly. Both had left school. I doubt they even were there at the age of 14. Both came from working class London families. Both were of the age that they went off to fight in the war. They both had very active wars in different ways, came home to real poverty. But they were absolutely enraptured by art and culture, music. And I remember that for my birthday, I was very fond of this lady who helped in my parents' shop for decades. And she always bought me a birthday present, and she bought me amazing things. I remember one year, the Sibelius Violin Concerto, just to take a piece at random. Another year, the Borodin Second Symphony, pieces I absolutely love. And look, they weren't super educated. They weren't really educated at all. And they weren't, they didn't have a deep or what we'd call in any way intellectual understanding of Western civilization, but they knew it was something that it was worth aspiring to. They aspired to it, and it gave them huge amounts of enjoyment and gratification in their lives. And then I compare that to when I started working. Actually, in my late 20s, I ended up working in a consultancy where almost everyone had been to Oxford or Cambridge. And they'd all come, not necessarily from super privileged families, but they'd had years of education and they'd gone to the best universities. And they were really, really clever. But most of them wouldn't know. I mean, if I said to them, oh, it's quite interesting to compare Mozart and Haydn string quartets, for example. Or, I mean, never mind the difference between Shostakovich and Schoenberg. I mean, they would not have had a clue. And they would have thought I was being a terrible snob, even talking in these terms. But really what it boils down to is my sense that we have an amazing heritage and legacy, however you define what Western civilization is. I don't mean to rubbish or disparage any other civilization. I'm not going to say it's better or worse, although it is interesting that the appeal that classical music has in Asia, for example. I did go to a concert when I was in Singapore, and the performers and it seems to be truly transnational, and maybe that means it's special. But whatever, whether it's superior, inferior, or equal to other civilizations, I feel we live in a time of mass education. People spend years and years learning, and they're not really appreciating and imbibing this stuff. And this stuff, I suppose, after my family relations, after my marriage and my children, so again, a link to demography maybe, is the thing that's most important to me in the world. And I'll just close with one anecdote. I'm not going to say who it is, but I knew a very, very senior, well-known clergy person, let's put it that way, who said to me, I was listening to the Schubert Quintet the other day, and I have to admit, it moved me more than any prayer ever has, although I'm not supposed to say that. So I think it's just something that's incredibly life enhancing. And if I can encourage others to have their lives enhanced by it, so much the better.
Paul, that bit you mentioned at the end, how the musical experience you had was transcendental in a way that prayers haven't moved you toward, is interesting, because I think those who do attend church, they sometimes can't get on board with the sermon. It can either be too theological or a little bit too bland. But when it comes to the hymns, if it's a really, really good hymn, it's rousing. People understand the message. They get it through the feeling. There's something about music that can bring a message home that word on its own perhaps can't. Ed, why do you think that the appreciation of the canon has diminished in recent generations?
I suppose I'm like Paul. I think he described himself as a techno-optimist but cultural pessimist, and I'm of the same brand. I think we'll probably all end up living to 300, but spend our time watching TikTok reels with them all. I don't know. I have to admit, I have a sort of ingrained tendency towards pessimism about at least on these cultural issues, and I've also found that there is also a particular British aversion to high culture and intellectualism, which I think is also always been there and is in some ways quite protective, in that we sort of tend to not take continental ideas too seriously. But I mean, this started. Well, I originally wrote a sort of article about it, about why aren't there sort of Canon Club, it's why they aren't there kind of salons where people talk about these things, and we end up hosting with a friend, 3 of them, before this. My basic fear was kind of personal one, is that I felt like I wasn't educated enough, and that's entirely my own fault, especially classical music. I'm not so into it, and I find as an outsider, it's very hard to sort of get to grips with it. It's almost like a language to start off. Once you have that background, it's different. And I also felt there was I sort of fear that we aren't passing on these traditions, that our children aren't going to know about them, and that all these they're sort of going to end up like dusty books and libraries, which are still there, and no one's stopping them, and no one's burning them, but no one's taking an interest anymore. There is obviously an argument that technology just offers so many different opportunities for people. I mean, it's just so much easier to watch television than to read, for example, and that's been a complaint for some time. But I do think the general culture in Britain has become quite moronic. And my main gripe with the BBC, for example, is that if you just turn on any television, BBC, and I just don't watch it for this reason more than anything, it's so incredibly lowbrow. And even documentaries that try to look at culture or history, for example, just take it as assumed that everyone watching it is a complete moron, and it has to be at the very, very lowest level. So, my hope is that there can be, within this kind of mix, an enlightened media which tries to assume that everyone has an actual interest in high culture and would like to learn more. We're in our own small little way doing that to sort of create that. That's my hope anyway. I mean, whether people are actually interested, maybe people just want to watch TikTok reels about Baby Gronk for the rest of their lives. I don't know.
Your point about BBC being incredibly lowbrow, it's true to say that it wasn't always the case. And back in the 70s, and I know you chaps sort of watched this, I'm sure. In fact, Ed, I'm sure I've seen you write about it, but Kenneth Clarke's Civilization series.
Richest news ever.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite unbelievable. And I think he opens with what is civilization, and he tries to ask the question and answer the question. And what's really sad about the BBC now is that on iPlayer, you can't even go and find things like civilization. They've removed them, and you got to go on YouTube. And so I'm gonna refract that into a demographic question, actually, Paul, because as you write about, and as you well know, the West has gone through a demographic transition. It's some could point towards inevitable collapse, however it is that you want to look toward it. And we live in a cultural and political landscape which sees new terminology thrown up, usually with a progressive bent, which is in some way to diminish the Western peoples. And you'll hear terms like global majority to try and point towards the legitimacy of non-Western peoples who have settled in the West. Do you think there is, and I don't know if you're alluding to it earlier on, do you think that in this world of growing diasporas, and I can see a rising sense of Anglo identity, particularly in our Zoomer generation, is this a way in which to hold on to something of substance for this culture and its admirers, should that demographic collapse come to pass?
Well, that's a huge question. I think when we were planning this, one of the strap lines I wanted to use somehow, and I don't think we have, is when it comes to the culture wars, we need more culture and less war. Now, I don't think we don't need war. I think it's Ed who said when you're accused of engaging in the culture wars, it normally means you're just not waving the right white flag, right? So I do agree, though, that I do think we need culture wars when certain ideas are being suggested and then imposed. It's perfectly legitimate to push back on them. Ideas that have been historically completely contrary to what people believe. Now, that doesn't mean they're wrong, and it's perfectly legitimate to discuss them. But neither does it mean, because an idea is new and would have shocked and horrified previous generations, that it's right and that it's an outrage. So I think in this venture, there's something about culture wars and at least putting a bit of culture into the culture war and not just war. And that sort of comes to remembering what it is that if we believe in Western civilization, it's three things I always think, essentially. It's first of all, the amazing scientific and technological advances we've made, which the techno-optimism, which Ed was talking about, which I do hold to, which has allowed us to lead these comfortable lives. Here we are on Zoom, sitting in December in warm rooms in England and Scotland with full stomachs. A whole range of things which go back 8 or 9 generations. And many people 3 or 4 generations, that would not have been the case. So the technological brilliance of science, which allows us to understand the world and to control it and to live much better lives. The second thing is the political settlement, imperfect though it is, that allows us to sit here broadly for now and have conversations about all sorts of things and have some contribution to the political situation in the country, somehow have a sense of being in a legitimate political order. And then the third thing is Western civilization and the canon and the classics and the absolute genius. Transcendental, I think, was the word you used. And that is a word I think that absolutely hits the nail on the head. In many ways, in fact, it kind of became the religion of Europe as religion waned in the late 19th century among intellectuals, anyway, art for art's sake and so on. And I think that contribution is extraordinary. Now, I don't know I haven't really thought about it in terms of a sort of demographically declining group of people holding on to something as they diminish. But I do think that in the wokeness, there is a degree of hostility to classical civilization, to Western civilization. So that I remember I went to I think it was a Singer Sargent exhibition, and I last year, and I also went to the Rijksmuseum, and I think in both occasions I ended up taking a photo of the clip, the sort of explanatory clip, and sending it to Ed. It was just, it was politically correct, blah blah, unless it was talking about slavery or something, it just wasn't worth. And I almost can't bear to go into the British Museum. And just because I can't bear to read the explanatory plaques, everything has to be refracted through some kind of post-colonial lens. And again, I've got no problem with that as a literature and a way of thought, but it seems to have become the case that if it's not universal, if that is not the lens through which you are seeing and interpreting something, then there is really no other lens through which you should be seeing it. And I think it was the head of the South Bank Centre, there was some major cultural figure or sort of manager who said, "Ooh, classical music's not cool." And you see that in the decline of orchestral music, certainly. I mean, Wigmore Hall, for example, is still wonderful. But you get less and less classical orchestral music outside the proms in London. So I think there is, maybe it's not really answering your question, but along with the culture wars, I think there is an extent to which there is a war on Western culture, however defined. And if Western culture is to be appreciated, it can only be appreciated through the lens of a post-colonial narrative. Now, again, let's look at it through a post-colonial lens, fine, but can that be one of many lenses to look through it rather than the only one that is legitimate? And it seems particularly at exhibitions, that's the case. The choice of music on Radio 3, for example, it seems that if you don't have a composer from a minority background or a woman every so often, someone at Radio 3 has said you have to do that. Now, again, there may be wonderful composers from many different backgrounds we haven't appreciated, and there may be many great women composers. So I don't mind. I think that's wonderful to expose us to some new folks. But on the whole, I'm afraid the dead white man still has the quality when it comes to music. And, it feels like substandard music's being imposed, and that music's being imposed, not hugely, but to an extent on, say, Radio 3, because of the identity of the composer rather than the quality of the music. And I could name you, I'm not going to composers I hear on Radio 3, where I say, if that weren't an X or a Y by some kind of category or class, that music would not be on the radio. And I think one could say that fairly objectively.
I heard you earlier on referring to being culturally pessimistic, techno-optimistic. And that cultural pessimism, I think, ties into, I wouldn't necessarily say just a general feeling, but something that I know one of your guests who came on to speak about Macbeth on the Canon Club, Nima Parvini, he's a Shakespeare scholar who's also written lots about cycles of history, and he wrote a book called The Prophets of Doom, where he brought out 11 historians and other various cultural commentators and literateurs from history that put their own theories forward as to why the West was facing into civilizational decline, and bringing out lots of examples of how that has happened to every civilization in the past. If we are moving through this declining periods. This it's coming up to the end of whatever was Western civilization, and we're going into something new. People often say that as you go into something new, it is seeded from the old. If that's the case, what's worth saving from the past?
Oh, I mean, so much. I mean, I'm not a total doom monger. I don't think Western civilization is falling in any kind of immediate sense. We have reached a sort of level of takeoff where it would take an immense destruction to actually ruin it. There are certain matrices and indices that do suggest that there is a sort of exhaustion, which is what Kenneth Clark talked about, and also a sort of level of I suppose cultural cringe or unwillingness to kind of continue the civilization in many ways. I mean, Paul was talking about the sort of Western civilization is kind of unusual in that it aspires to be global, and it succeeds in being global, just as Western medicine aims to be. So it really is something that is open to everyone. And even if the civilization does start to decline, the Western tradition is something that others will probably adopt. So, I mean, even if the West fell tomorrow, Beethoven would still be loved around the world, and Mozart would still be loved around the world. And those things will continue. I think one thing we haven't mentioned so far is, or kind of alluded to, is the religious aspect of it, which is, there is a feeling that, Western civilization is so linked to the Christian tradition in particular, that when the knowledge and understanding of that tradition starts to decline, and becomes irrelevant to people, then the kind of the sort of fundamental civilization behind it will also start to collapse too. I mean, one of the things that made me think about this was when I heard someone explain how in their office, again, as Paul says, these were kind of like, highly educated, high power people. Someone visitor from Africa had started talking about the prodigal son, and everyone just looked at him, said, and literally didn't understand what that meant. And I think once that kind of religious literacy starts to fall, then a lot of the things around it start to collapse as well, especially with classical music. It's so hard to really understand the history of classical music without the religious influence. Now, I know that starts to decline over time, but it really is the sort of foundation. Similarly with art, it's, we discussed Caravaggio, and it's impossible to understand Caravaggio without the importance of religion. So I think that is a kind of fundamental aspect of it. But I suppose in a kind of post-religious age, certain aspects of the civilization will remain, but they will evolve into something different. I mean, I almost wonder if, Western society now is so different to what it was 70 years ago in its moral values. It's arguably almost more different than that era was to the medieval period. Those were recognizably the same civilization. And now we're into something sort of different. And once civilization has changed, so many of the things from the past civilization will just be forgotten. I mean, they won't literally be lost. Like, probably 99% of the writing in antiquity was literally lost because there just wasn't technology to keep it. It was just fell to pieces. A lot of the aspects of the old civilization will still be there. They'll still be an archive somewhere, and they'll still be on the internet, but just no one will read them. No one will listen to them in many cases. So it's not the same kind of collapse, but it's similar.
Have either of you ever read Alistair MacIntyre's philosophical work, After Virtue? You ever come across that before?
I've read it twice, and I remember it. There's a rather different books. I probably read it about 20 and about 40. But it's much cited, more cited, I think, than probably read or understood.
Yeah, the introduction to that book encapsulates what we've just spoken about quite nicely, which was he postulates some kind of thought experiment, which is imagine that there are these citizens who come upon an archival repository that had shreds of the in this case, it's about scientific experiments, it's scientific understanding. And they're trying to figure out how to build this thing back up. I can't quite remember what it was. And he uses it as a metaphor to say, this is our inheritance from the past. And you mentioned it now, Red, as lots of writing was lost. He talks about how Aristotle, what we've come to know him as being one of the greatest philosophers alive for, is that was a fraction of what we know he wrote. It was all in Alexandria before it was destroyed. And so there are all these little fragments that we pick up on. And we've based our civilization upon those, and now I suppose what we're talking about is an even bigger break from whatever those fragments were, and in some cases these long traditions, the Christian tradition, and we've gone, as you say, out in these last 70 years. You've written a very good post about this, actually, as if someone was to have been put in a cryogenic chamber before that point 70 years ago, and then woken up today and saw the streetscape and all the various new cultural references, like the various flags that are being waved here and there, and the things that people said and believed, they would think they've woken up on another planet. And I suppose the question I downstream from those, you've talked about Caravaggio and that Catholic worldview, which endured for so long, and of course was picked up in the Protestant era as well. It produced great art and great buildings. There's great inventions in that. In these eras where there've been lots of self-restraint and self-governance, in the Victorian era, people like to look back on it as being prudish and snobbish, but it also produced all the railways, the London Underground, the great town halls, great buildings that we all look back on and go, that was wonderful. And yet in today's era, where we have, desire maximization, we've gotten rid of all these shards of civilization that we once had. Can we actually imagine producing anything else worthy of the canon when our museums are full of unmade beds, these art galleries, and we've got glass and steel box buildings instead? Is there anything that we can imagine being produced of such enduring stature like the works that we've spoken about so far?
Is this to me or?
Well, open question.
I think it's some areas of art continue to improve, I think, and continue to produce great works. Music. The music my kids listen to is, some of it's great. I know Paul and I have different views on which type of music is best, but there is still an immense amount of talent out there, and we just have huge agglomeration advantages as well in certain areas, because the internet allows people to collaborate in so much other ways. Like podcasts, for example. That is an art form of the 21st century, and it continues to get better. Television, in the first decade of the 21st century, it was absolutely at its peak. I think it's got a bit worse now, but television drama making, for example. So when there aren't constraints on things, then things do tend to get better. But if you compare that with documentary making, so obviously documentary making in the 70s was just obviously so much better in Britain. It's not just Kenneth Clark, but Robert Hughes, The World of War, The Ascent of Man. These are all very highbrow things that just couldn't be made. So that is obviously shows that where there is a cultural cringe at work, that does have an impact on artistic outputs. Architecture, and to a certain extent modern art, have perverse incentives that encourage bad things to be made, and the mechanisms aren't really there to reverse that. Now, in the past, you might have had wealthy patrons to fund good things. Now, I don't know if there's enough. I don't know if billionaires still do that to a certain extent in terms of art. It doesn't seem to be the same things, and often elites tend to have pretty bad taste in a lot of stuff. But that there are areas which tend to be, I suppose, more free market, where things do continue to get better. So I think it is possible. The downside, the pessimistic view of the documentary decline is just that there aren't enough people interested in it, which is what would worry me more. Maybe just people have lost interest in actually knowing stuff.
I think it's quite important for our podcast that we don't come over, and I think Ed is not coming over as a fogey in any way, And I think what
Very
we're
down with the
saying,
kids, Paul.
sorry,
I'm very down with the kids.
it's very important that what we're saying is this is a wonderful legacy. We're all better off enjoying it, appreciating it. That doesn't mean that we're trashing other civilizations, and it doesn't mean that we're trashing what's happening today. So to say that the past is rich and worth understanding is not to say that it's better or worse than other pasts or than the present. And I agree with Ed. I think you have to be fairly selective in what's got. Some things have got better, some things have got worse. I mean, I agree that the early 21st century television was definitely better. Some of the Netflix type series that I watched, don't spend a lot of time watching it, but I have got through a few of those classics, and I think they are absolutely fantastic and far better than what we were watching on our black and white sets. What I was watching on my black and white set in the 70s, I don't think Ed was, when we had, I remember the day that Channel 4 started, we had 3 channels. And now I can, instead of listening to, sometimes I do listen to Radio 4 in my breakfast, and still, I'll finish off that podcast I started listening to the other day. So that's how technology, which is actually more interesting if the news is not interesting that day. So the technology is amazing, and it can help spread and give access to better forms of culture. The other thing that I think is really difficult to judge the culture of your day. Everybody knows that going back to the days of the Romans and perhaps the Greeks, each generation saw decline, and it's very easy to get into that mindset. And the great thing about the canon is that over time, however the process works, there is a process which sieves out the gold, actually. And whenever, I've been listening to classical music seriously now since I was about 7, and I'm 60. So I've listened to an awful lot. And that's not to say there aren't amazing pieces and even amazing composers that I come across from time to time. But as I get older, less and less. And I think that's not because my taste is getting more conservative. I think there just is only so much really, really good stuff. If you haven't heard of it, it's probably because it's not, or if I haven't heard of it, it's probably because it's not that amazing. And actually, there's a sifting process that goes on. And that, in a way, is what the canon is. It's that strange sifting process which changes over time and different people contribute to. But ultimately, what comes out the other end is the goal. The trouble is that when you're living in the present and the water hasn't sifted through the sieve, if that's a good analogy, it's difficult to say what the canon of today will be. Actually, I saw it the other day and someone asked him, how many books have you written? And he said, well, 2 and whatever. And then I thought I should have said to him then, the Ed West canon has not yet been canonized. We don't know what will come through as the great Ed West works. There's quite a lot out there. Some may be not. So I think the trouble with, first of all, just to reiterate, I don't want to be vague. You should say, it's all getting to hell in a handcart. Some things are getting better, some things are getting worse. But secondly, in the present, really difficult for any individual to know. But I think the test of time when it comes to art, music, and literature is a great test. And when things turn up that got forgotten, which they do, it's a fallible process. And thank goodness the odd bit of gold gets found sort of discarded. But on the whole, you need to go through the process to know what's really worthwhile.
As we were talking there, it got me thinking about how the way we live now perhaps won't be conducive to producing these really deep, enduring works of art. And this was brought to mind when last month my fiance and I went to Wordsworth's house in Grasmere, and there was a wonderful VT before we went into his house, which had voiceovers of various parts of his poetry, and it was explaining his and his sister's motivations for moving back to their native Lake District. And I think he in particular had been taken with the ideas of the French Revolution, gone over there, and then realized, this abstract ideal hasn't quite worked out in practice, and I've gotten dispirited. And he returns home, and there was this poetry that his sister wrote, which elucidates the point I'm trying to make, which is she wrote a line saying, "We have a boat upon the lake in a small orchard and a smaller garden, which as it is the work of our own hands, we regard with pride and partiality." And uh, I noticed as there were little um, excerpts of commentary about how they lived around the house, they were all being turned into these modern self-help phrases. For example, the reason why they were so prolific was plain living and high thinking, and we can relate to that only by way of an abstraction. But if we look at it, these were people who they were part of that republic of letters. They were friends with all of these other elites. So the elites of that time were very well read, both of each other's works of high literature and poetry. They knew the music. They all were steeped in, as you've already talked about, Ed, that worldview. And yeah, if you compare it to the way we live today, I mean, even myself, I mean, when I'm doing my day job, I'm just bouncing around an Outlook calendar. I'm jumping on various email apps, instant messaging apps. I have to purposefully carve out some time in the day in which my attention is not disturbed in any way, so that I can think about how to make the connections between things, what I might speak to people about, and pay attention to that book. But the most people that live today, just as we talked about, they'll go to Netflix. It's easier to watch a TV program, and we have such a life busy of distraction that I can't see how, even with a unifying worldview, how that can lead to that depth. And indeed, when I speak to friends, I know, Paul, you said you can get novels today that can be as good as back in the 19th century, but there are people who say there's something missing. It doesn't quite capture what it means to be human. And indeed, we spend most of our time in these disembodied forms anyway. Do you think there's anything to that, Ed?
You mean about the lack of time or the distractions?
Yeah, a combination of the two. Do you find it impacts even yourself and what it is you seem to produce?
I mean, I suppose amongst the sort of upper middle class go-getting types, especially in the US, but also to an extent in Western Europe, there is a time poverty thing. But I mean, if you look at the data, most people actually work less now than they did sort of 50 years ago. So I'm not sure that that's really a reason for a lot of it. I think the distractions are much more. There are just, there are easier options than sitting around reading a book or composing poetry. I remember when lockdown started and we were all stuck in the house together, and I said to my kids, okay, we're all going to write short stories like Boccaccio after the plague, and this will be our little thing, and I'm going to go through a session. I'm going to teach you English history every 2 days, and all these things just fell away within 2 days. They're just really hard, and I was just busy with work. They had some homework to do, but everyone just got distracted, and everyone had a million things to do. I do think, as a general trend, society's probably just become a bit more dispersed in that more people are doing a variety of things in their lives. So there are people sort of focusing non-stop on the arts and classics, but they're just a sort of very small niche subculture. And there are lots more people who just spend all their time watching television. There's just liberal society means that more people tend to have choice in what they want to do in their lives. And studying, poetry, for example, is very much in decline. I mean, if we want to talk about, some things have got better, some things got worse. There is a small sort of subculture of people into it, but it's just going to remain a small thing on the long tail of society. I think to a certain extent with novel writing, that probably is also in decline as well. But the growing arts are the popular arts, and it has been television recently. I mean, I know Paul might think this is the very lowest brow, but like gaming and stuff, like game design is where, I mean, that's where the incentives are. That's where the kind of developments are happening. And even stuff with, like film scores and gaming music is like a huge growth area. And some of it is actually very good. Whether that's as kind of meaningful as poetry in the long term, I mean, I Can't really tell. I just think generally society is just much more dispersed. Everyone's got their own niche interests. Some people are working really long hours. Some people are working no hours. There's just much more variety in our lives than
It's interesting. There is actually a poem by Wordsworth, "The world is too much with us," which just made exactly the same point, that we getting and spending, we spend our time running around. So I think it may be a question of perspective. I think the other thing I was going to say is, of course, in his day, the vast majority of people were across the world, and even in England, although decreasingly, they were agricultural laborers. Literacy was very low. So not everybody was Dorothy and William Wordsworth in the late 18th century. So we do have to accept that certain things, certain art forms, certain parts of the culture are going to be more accessible. It just gets back to the point I made about the shop worker I was mentioning, that it should be much wider than it is. It doesn't need to be tiny. The last thing I was going to say on that subject is that there is a problem today with people's short attention spans. I do think that's an issue. And what it's giving rise to is these bite-sized, TikTok-sized pieces of output. Now, they may be very good, and an individual song may be very good. But if you think about a symphony, a Bruckner symphony, Bruckner is one of the composers that we talked about, and Bruckner and Mahler, who's a later generation, but he knew Bruckner and was influenced by him. They wrote symphonies that, when I was buying records back when I was in my late teens, were two long players. So they went on for about an hour and a half. And whilst a song is a wonderful thing, I think rather like the ability to build a cathedral versus a hut or a little house, it's a sign of a great civilization when things can be done on scale. To write a symphony is not just one down tune after another. It has a structure, it has a form, it has development, it has recapitulation. I mean, I won't bore you with the theory of sonata form, but it's like a great piece of architecture. It couldn't hang together without a certain level of precedent and design and thought. And the same can be said for the novel, that these are great structures that are great, that their size and their scope. That doesn't mean a song isn't wonderful, or a string quartet, which may also be quite long, but for much smaller resources. But the idea that you could put together a symphony with all those people and all that time, all those instruments, the space that's required, the number of people needed to appreciate it and come and listen to the concert, and the interior design, the structure. If we are not able to appreciate those things anymore, then that does seem to me like genuine civilizational decline, which is maybe analogous to people in the 6th century not being able to build on the scale that the Romans could build, and old Roman buildings falling apart. So I think that is one thing that does worry me with all the technology, wonderful though it is, the shortening of attention spans, and the sense that maybe our civilizational output now is little bite chunks, and we don't have the attention to sustain the grand structures. And that does seem to me to be a measurable indication of possibly a decline of the civilization.
I do think the attention span issue is definitely real. I mean, I think I've got worse over the years, and iPhones probably do play a part. And if you can, television, I said television's got better, but also it's become much quicker. I tried making my daughter watch the original Sherlock Holmes, not the original one, the 1980 Sherlock Holmes, because they watched Sherlock, and each scene, the opening scene was like 5 minutes, and she said, I can't believe how long this is. My Zoomer brain can't handle this. I do think where there are incentives and when there are financial incentives, people will engage in complex things. I mean, even people do still read like genre fiction, which can be incredibly complex. And the great television shows of the noughties were also compared to sort of novels, in the sense that they're much more complicated than films, and they can go on, and structurally they are hugely complex in a way films aren't. Thing is, I don't know what to do about the attention span thing, because that technology is there with us, and there's just no way of getting rid of it. And whether we will, I don't know, whether we'll have some sort of Ozempic, for attention span is a widespread thing. I suppose that's kind of already happening with ADHD medication. But I do think if there was if there was a market for these classical compositions, and if there was money to be made from them, if someone was prepared to give loads of money to people to compose them, then I think they could still be possible in the way that complex television is obviously money making.
Paul, when you were talking about great pieces of music hanging together, you can't just look at one note in isolation or a couple of notes in isolation and get the measure of the whole thing. Is that there's a motivation and a worldview and all these other things imbued within the design, and that's what gives it the sense of whatever it is that you're listening to. There was a section within the conversation you were having with Nima Parvini, the pair of you, on Macbeth, and Nima was mentioning how there was so many cultural references and literary references being made quite implicitly within there, but specifically for the monarch for whom he'd been commissioned to write it for. And that's a great example of a work of art, which we now look at it back as a key part of the canon, indeed most of what Shakespeare wrote. And we go, God, look at that. How did he come up with that? And to know that it was, as you both mentioned, commissioned by the elite of the time, and he was just so stewed in all of this literary thought and this worldview, and it's tangentially linking it to your point about attention span. It makes me wonder what anything that we might deem great, not in comparison to the past, but great from our age, might speak to, because we talked about how it hangs together because of the religious aspect or the cultural aspect of the time. But in a recent post you wrote, Ed, on the Macbeth, it made me wonder whether we'll keep the vernacular that we've become so used to in the English language. So Macbeth gave the English language one fell swoop, the milk of human kindness. Is this a dagger which I see before me? And now the cultural milieu, elites and non-elites alike, are all on the internet, and we speak in memes, and there's wording and phraseology that we all share in the Anglosphere and beyond that. So it'll be interesting for historians of the future to look back and go, what was the thing that's making it all hang together? And I dare say they might find slightly less highbrow things sitting behind it, the frog memes and what have you.
It will seem very ephemeral, a lot of it. I suppose, the kind of cultural churn will be so quick that we won't actually know. But I mean, everything is just sort of niche based and sort of within sort of small sort of social circles and minorities now. I'm not sure there is an overhanging culture in the same way. I mean, on the Macbeth thing, it's worth pointing out that I think the Macbeth we now know is a kind of cut down version, isn't it? Because it was performed for the king, most likely, and he wanted it short. So I mean, that kind of.
So we're not the only ones with bad attention spans. Even the great and the good had them.
I think a great work of art should not require you to get all the references. And then as you get into it, if you decide to spend the time examining it, layers will peel away and you'll understand more. But if it's good, you shouldn't need, I feel it's true of a poem, it's true of a piece of music and art. If you look at a piece of Caravaggio, for example, and you don't know the biblical story, I think it still hits you with a wow factor because it's really great art. And then you can choose to delve into it and understand it better. And that's something that we're doing, I hope. But it shouldn't be essential. You should be able to appreciate the piece of work for itself and not just in reference to other things, interesting though those may be. I think there's also something else which is at work, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying about the world of people who grew up in the 1940s or grew up in the 1970s, or the different generations. The 1940s was a very egalitarian era, but materially, particularly with planning and the war and so on. But culturally, there was a sense of hierarchy, great things to aspire to that could be opened up to everyone. And actually, that was very much the philosophy of the Soviet Union once it's gone through its proletarian culture and various other phases. And it had its various crazinesses with inventing something called formalism and then persecuting people who were supposed to be formalists. But essentially, by the end, in its last decades, it did say the great works of civilization should be the property of everybody. And what I feel we live in now is an era of extreme material inequality and a sort of faux cultural equality, where the elites, maybe this is a bit conspiratorial, but maybe the elites as a way of holding on to their totally disproportionate and huge wealth, sort of dumb themselves down and decline. I remember when it was Gordon Brown went on was it when he went on Desert Island Disc? He was talking about the Arctic monkeys, whoever they are or were, and whether he really liked them or it was all a pose. Whereas Enoch Powell, remember Enoch Powell going on Desert Island Discs, and he chose one Beethoven, and however all the rest was all Wagner, and he spoke sort of with great enthusiasm about where we were in the ring cycle and so on. I think there's almost a sense, and as I said, maybe this is a bit conspiratorial, that in an era of extreme material inequality, the elites, I'll bounce this off our friend Matt Goodwin and see if he likes it, Ed, because the question of the elites is definitely something he's interested in, that the elites pose as culturally egalitarian.
Yeah, I think those two things are definitely linked, and I've long thought it. That is probably the sort of broadly socialist case for encouraging culture. It's a sort of, it kind of acts as a kind of secret password into higher echelons of society. And this is what it does annoy me when there is a kind of cultural cringe about, we must got to dumb things down because kids from working class backgrounds won't understand art or culture. So if they are able to even, if you're from a poor background and you will get a basic grasp of some of these cultural things, it's such a door opener to life. Because lots of people who would have gone to good schools will still know a fair bit about it. Not as much as they might have, but I remember this years ago. I was speaking to one of my wife's friends who'd gone to Edinburgh University. It was quite posh, and he made it a reference to Piers Gaveston, as if, and he didn't know me, as if like anyone would know who he is. So there's not 1 in 100 people in many schools who would know who that is. But the fact that you have that kind of common historical reference is such a sort of secret door pass to elite status.
Do they not cover him in Pride Week, do you think?
I don't know. Yeah. I'm sure maybe, yeah, a lot. But yeah, those there is the argument that elites do kind of keep traditional classical culture to themselves as sort of as their own little thing, while pretending to sort of be down with the public. All politicians do that, don't they? They sort of pretend to sort of dumb down. It's very tiring. Remember Theodore Dalrymple said that in Who's Who, every member of the cabinet listed football as their interests, and he said he didn't know what was worse, whether like if they were pretending to, or if they actually all like football that much. He was a tremendous cultural snob, and he is. So, but he's correct about it. I think it is important for elites to sort of lead the way on culture. And I think actually in terms of politicians, I think they'd actually get rewarded if they honestly were asked what their things, and they said, I don't actually care about whatever the Arctic monkeys. I'm actually into Wagner. I think people would actually like it.
And it does rather remind me, going back to that generation that I was talking back earlier, my father arrived in this country as a penniless refugee. And by the time I knew him, culture wasn't particularly important to him. But I do remember one of his friends saying that when we were, all penniless refugees together in Birmingham, they were living in a hostel. My father used to drag them off to see Shakespeare. They probably barely, their English was extremely rudimentary at that stage. But it was just like, that's what we should be doing. That's how we get entry into this country. That's the culture we now have to enter. And we have to go through this and figure it out and appreciate it, because that's how we join this culture, this civilization, this nation. Right. I think that's rather admirable. Sorry, Ed.
Yeah, so I've suggested before the Life in the UK test, which I've done for an article, which is all about, what percentage of people in Britain are living on benefits. All these kind of pointless questions of no interest. It should literally just be a Shakespeare quiz. Here's 100 questions about Shakespeare, and if you know enough about Shakespeare, you know enough about English civilization that you're halfway there at least.
Mm. Well, it's the Catherine Birrell Singh model, isn't it? She is introducing this to a great many different peoples who've recently come to the island, and they all really get into it. She sees it as her duty to, in this world which has gone for the multiculturalism model, which I guess is just downstream of having lots of different people who want to champion their own culture. It's probably not a policy goal in and of itself. It's probably just an effect of that cause. But she says, look, if you want people to feel British, if you want to feel part of something, show them what it is that this country is and was built upon, and don't treat them and dumb them down. And you can make that case for actually making that point before, poorer kids from working class backgrounds. I mean, Roger Scruton was one of those people, whether you're into conservative philosophy or not. I mean, he was just a philosopher with conservative inclinations, but he got to Oxford's on a scholarship, went through the grammar school system, and said, look, if that wasn't there, and indeed this is the point that Peter Hitchens makes all the time about having abolished that, is that I would never have gotten to this. I would never have been given a chance, because I would have just been, I wouldn't have been anywhere near the grammar schools because we couldn't afford to be around that area. But my working man father, who was a Labour supporter and thought all of this stuff was guff, I think Roger Scruton effectively referred to it as, is something that I found great joy in, and he ended up being one of the biggest contributors to British national life, or at least in the cultural conversation in the 20th and early 21st centuries, and indeed beyond into Europe with all of those countries that were under the Iron Curtain. He helped get some of this stuff we've been talking about today, the Western canon, through the back door of these, authoritarian dictatorships. So, there's a lot that hangs on this kind of stuff, and I know we've talked a lot about our own personal relationship with it and worries about it, but actually, there's a whole lot of stuff around human self-realization going on here too, and getting to the depths of humanity. We've spoken about a whole range of topics today, and before I let you go, I'm going to ask you both a question which I started to ask the guests after you'd both been on. And that question is, and I'll start with you, Paul, is what have you changed your mind on in the course of your life? And what was it that made you think differently?
I think for me, it's very much a generational question, because I was a politically precocious 14-year-old when Margaret Thatcher came to power. I was very struck by the sad state of the nation when I was at that age, and I thought I wished her well in what she was doing, and I still believe what she did was absolutely essential. And as a result of that, I suppose I went through a kind of libertarian, I was never a sort of fanatical libertarian, but I did think the small state would be the best solution. And I also thought that a very small state would emerge. People got more educated and wealthier. They would want to take more responsibility for themselves, and the state would kind of wither in a way. And that would be a good thing. And I've realized that was wrong. I think a lot of people of my generation have realized that, and others have still hold those prejudices. That's not to say I don't think free markets and so on are very important for the economy. But I do think that we need some kind of leadership, if you like, at the cultural level, at the national level. You can't just leave everything to the market, and that you do need institutions that set a gold standard of excellence. And, you talked about the BBC back in the 70s. I would add to that Brian McGee's series on philosophy, which is all available on YouTube. That's fantastic. And I think, if you just leave it to the market, you will end up with excellent stuff. There will be really good things out there for a small number of people. But I think society and culture needs a guiding hand. So I suppose I've become a bit more paternalistic in my cultural attitudes. And maybe that's a little bit what's behind this podcast.
Interesting. I think that call is growing amongst the Zoomers, and you might have come across him, but previous guest Charlie Downs, he's only 23, very, very adept with delivering messages. Very of his age, he's able to get quite a lot of content in and feeling it in a short period of time. But he has conservative inclinations, but ultimately believes that having seen the cultural elite and the various institutions be taken over by this socially left-leaning, economically right-leaning worldview, he said, look, conservatism's not going to cut it. We actually need to have some kind of a counter-revolution. It's very Christopher Rufo, the American chap who wrote about this stuff, which is, if you want to have cultural change in the direction toward maintaining anything from the past, then you're going to have to employ similar tactics. Now, I know that's not the point necessarily you're making, Paul, but you can see this growing sentiment about maybe we do need some paternalism to retain things of value, even if it isn't, valuable on a spreadsheet, as it were.
And I see it in demography as well. So, I would not have, and I think fewer people thought about pronatalism, but I would have thought, well, the market will sort it out. Now, I strongly believe that we need government and state-led. It's not the only thing, but it needs to be cultural and it needs to be financial. But I think our demographic woes need to be taken in hand by the establishment. We can't just let the thing drift and assume that somehow the hidden hand will sort it all out.
Podcast in itself. Ed, what about you? What previously was something you thought this is a good thing, or this is something I believe is set in stone, but then over time you changed your mind about?
I mean, I think I changed my mind quite a lot. Maybe too much on a lot of things. I mean, you mentioned grammar schools as one thing, for example. I used to be pro. Now I'm quite anti. I do think one of the fundamental problems we have with the meritocracy. I'm pro meritocracy in the sense that it's the least bad way of ordering society. But I think the decline of local elites has been a big factor in a lot of the social problems, and that when you take away the kind of top 10% of any group or any town or anything like that, the rest kind of falls to pieces a little bit. And I think grammar schools kind of mirror that a little bit. I think there's obviously people feel very great gratitude for their own experiences in education, and it's helped to kind of sort society along kind of levels of education and intelligence. But the downsides of that have become quite apparent as well. I think there needs to be some way of making making failure less brutal. Reading a couple of years ago Michael Young's book about meritocracy, the idea that if in a kind of free and liberal society, if you don't succeed and you fail, it's all the more crushing for you than it is in a kind of more kind of stultified society, because you know your place and you might not be happy about it, but you accept it. While in ours, the kind of cost of failure, especially for kind of low status men, is very, very crushing indeed. I mean, I think a lot of that comes down to in some ways a more paternalistic society, but I don't know. I mean, I'm a bit of a doomer in some sense, and I think a lot of these problems are they're just intractable. They're just the way it is. It's with like the loss of manufacturing jobs. There's just no way. It's sad that it happened. I just can't see, if industries aren't making a profit compared to competition from elsewhere, there's almost nothing we can do about it. Stuff with like the birth rate thing, I've become, maybe it's the Morland influence in me, but Paul Morland's, Paul, your latest book is about trying to reverse it, but the more I look at the data, I just think there's just nothing that anyone's doing that's really going to reverse it. All the sort of Central European countries, they're all, Poland's now at the absolute basement level of fertility, and I just wonder if that's just the price for a free liberal society. People have different options, and lots of people are choosing not to have kids. In many cases, they're choosing lifestyles which make it much harder for them to have children even if they want to. Just as the opportunities provided by technology just means more people want to watch rubbish TV or, look at TikTok reels.
So what you change your mind on, Ed, is reasons for pessimism, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that kind of unsolvable. I mean, there's lots that's great, and I would never want to live in a past time, even if there are much to benefit. The overall technological improvements are so much greater that it's worth. So much of our problems are just to do with choice and abundance, and those are kind of those are good problems, rather than the problems that a lot of people have in the world, which are to do with hunger and political instability
and high infant mortality rates.
High infant mortality and dentistry. Those two things that just make it. There's no competition between today and the past. A lot of things is that a lot of people are just not well suited to the lifestyle we now have. It makes them too anxious. And that is obviously a problem, but again, it's a kind of good problem. Anxiety levels increase as society gets better. People, who are having to struggle to survive the very safe survival of their children don't suffer from anxiety, existential despair, because they have other things to worry about. So, yeah, these just things that happen. There's not really much we can do about them except sort of tape around the edges. I mean, I hope there is a sort of a reversal of the fertility crisis, but I just don't see it around me anymore. Anyway, on that cheery note,
Yes, indeed. Well, we ought to talk about what we could expect from the pair of you. So you've embarked on this project with Canon Club. How far do you see it going? And is there anything else coming out from either of you, independently or together, that we ought to keep an eye out for?
We've got one more episode about to do, aren't we? Which is just going to be the two of us.
Well, there are a total of 7 done.
Yeah.
On I think Macbeth, Bruckner, and Anna Karenina have come out, and there are episodes to come on Thomas Mann, Romanesque architecture, Van Gogh, Caravaggio's come out, and we're planning to do one on. Ed wanted to do one just the two of us without a guest. So what did I know enough about? So I put my hand up on Shostakovich, which is interesting because I thought Ed would enjoy that because his life is very much intertwined with the Soviet Union and particularly.
I love Russian history and the history of Russian communism. Yeah. Just endlessly fascinating and full of so much bleak humor.
Actually, that does remind me. Sorry, I'll come back to a question. It does remind me. There's this. Is it synesthesia when people have this problem? They think Tuesday afternoon is red, right?
Yeah.
So I have that from music. What I was going to say is I don't think I couldn't possibly imagine thinking about George in London without knowing Handel, or Fin de siècle Vienna without knowing Mahler, or indeed the Stalin era. I mean, if you think you understand the Stalin era, but you don't know Shostakovich's 10th Symphony, so I mean, maybe, or indeed Edwardian England and Elgar. So for me, music's a great insight into history, and I think that's why that will be an interesting episode. In terms of so where we go with this in the long term, I don't know. We've made 7, we'll have made 8. We'll see what the reception is. I think these are podcasts that need to come out weekly. They're not contemporary or topical. So, hopefully they'll stand the test of time, be worth listening to down the road in years. And so, we may well make a second series at some point. It just remains to be seen what our other priorities are. Other things we're doing, I am trying to get together the thoughts on a book on the economics of demographic decline. So my basic idea is, which I'm working with an economist, Philip Pilkington on, which is, I think you've interviewed him, haven't you?
Yeah.
And we've written a paper together and we're about to produce another one. But really the idea is economics is informed by a view of demography that is, it doesn't really express it, but economics assumes reasonably young population, growing working age population. And if our demography is going to be radically different in the future, then we need to rethink everything about economics. So that's an idea and may end up being a book. And then another book, I've always got endless ideas for books, but another idea of a book I would really like to write, which very much sort of ties in with this idea of this podcast in a way, is what I'm kind of currently calling peak Europe. The idea that there was a time when European demography peaked, and use that, the 1880s, the 1890s, look at the culture, look at the economy, look at a whole range of things, and then see, both quantifiable and non-quantifiable. Was that really, in some sense, the peak of civilization? How would you argue that? And look at the music and the art and the literature, etc. So it's a very, it's not a very coherent idea for a book, but I might get around to writing that one day.
I hope you do. What about you, Ed? Besides your prolific writing on the wrong side of history Substack, what else is happening in your world?
I'm in the process of writing a book, which I'm very late for, which I'm supposed to send to the publishers this week. So hopefully, which is also about the elites, really, about the ruling class and the kind of paradoxes of them being progressive, but also sort of more inegalitarian than previous elites. So it's not really, it's not an anti-elitist book, because I'm not really anti-elitist, and I grew up in pretty comfortable circumstances. I grew up in Holland Park, so I can hardly pretend to be from like a mining village. But it is about that kind of contradiction. Why are elites sort of notionally more left-wing than the public, and kind of what the reason for this is, and not just self-interested financial reasons, but also kind of sort of quasi-religious reasons. It's it's kind of slightly difficult because I don't know which way the wind is blowing at the moment. So I don't, it's kind of radical progressivism we've had the last 10 years. Wokeness, I hate the word, but I don't know if it's getting better or getting worse. I mean, it's hard to tell, isn't it?
Perhaps it's time for a poem on Day of the Beach about wokeness.
Ed, if you do successfully get that draft to the publisher this week, when can we expect to see it hitting the shelves?
Late next year or even 26. I don't know. It was supposed to be ages ago, but it's trying to get all the ideas into my head, and also doing the Substack at the same time. So yeah,
a lot of words, a
lot
of ideas. Yes. Well, on that note, both of you have quite a lot on, so I am very grateful that you joined me once more on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure.
And look forward to speaking to you about both of your projects when they start coming to fruition, and indeed other things that you're working on in the meantime. So Paul, Ed, thanks so much for coming on again.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. Good luck with everything. To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class, and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.